Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. In fact, I remember my first meeting with one man. The girl understands perfectly well that there was nothing fateful about her at all. Her philosophy teacher had always said there was no such thing as fate, and she understood that perfectly well. However, when we consider past events, somehow what was inevitably going to happen did happen. And in such cases, people always say that, of course, it's all thanks to fate. And if it's really true, then the girl's meeting with this person was not an accident. Our story begins after this meeting took place. The girl was walking along the corridors of the spacious castle, already close to evening, and was carrying a letter in her hands. She walked into her husband Geiner's office and asked if he wanted to read it. Annette was smiling evilly as she said these words. The letter said it was addressed to Lady Rosenberg. But the man didn't even take his eyes off his papers and said he was very busy right now, so he suggested she talk a little later. But she insisted and said it had cost her a lot to make inquiries into his past. When Geiner heard these words, he immediately stopped writing, his hands suddenly trembling. He looked at Annette in surprise and couldn't believe she had actually done it. But the girl put her hands together, correcting her wedding ring, and said that she had always been curious as to why he treated her that way. Annette looked him straight in the face and told him that she didn't know why the man who loved her so much had suddenly changed, just beyond recognition. She said she was well aware that sometimes feelings cool down, but wondered if he thought it was too much. The man was silent for a while, and then he said her name. She interrupted him and said that everything was clear to her now. She asked if she understood correctly that he had approached her on purpose then. The first time they met, it was all deliberately done according to his plan. Geiner was silent for a while. Then with a heavy sigh he said that it was indeed true. The girl had mixed feelings, but then she put her head down and suddenly laughed. She couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. She was the one who said it must have been incredibly hard for him to pretend to be in love with the daughter of his enemy. And just like that, the meeting, which the girl considered fateful and incredibly happy, was only part of this man's plan, which was detailed. Annette had no idea that she was playing a game he had invented. She thought they were really in love with each other and were ready to live their lives together. Marquis Dietrich is actually her father, and he came to the Emperor as a nephew. The man was also a member of the royal Rosenberg family. Her father was an army general for Denmark, and when Geiner finished his service, he personally thanked the lad for it. And Geiner Waldemar, in turn, was at that time corps commander and his subordinate part-time. Their first meeting was at her estate in a garden that was filled with blooming roses that filled the space around them. And after 2 years of courtship, he proposed marriage to her. And it seemed to Natty that they had everything perfect, and she was living as if in a fairy tale. However, every fairy tale has an end, and the happiness that was supposed to last forever, as she thought, abruptly cut short in an instant. A king was assassinated, the monarchy was overthrown by a revolutionary army, and the nobility eventually fell definitively. At the hands of revolutionaries killed the girl's father, and her mother committed suicide, unable to bear her loss. And the leader of this revolution was Geiner, as the girl soon found out. But Annette was so in love with him that she obeyed him even at the cost of betraying her father. And since then, the man has changed completely. He even began to raise his hand to the girl, though he had never done so before. However, the girl still didn't want to believe that he had met her from the beginning with a devious intent. She really believed that he loved her. Well, the man had always maintained that the Rosenbergs had to answer for all their actions, and the girl did try to understand him in such situations. She convinced herself that he had been forced to make that choice because times were different now, but he also eventually began to argue that she herself must answer for her crimes. The girl believed until the very last moment that he loved her. However, in the eyes of the people, she was the only daughter of the general of the royal army, who suppressed the rebellion. Annette was an inferno and a bloodsucker, and in the eyes of all these people, they eventually even started coming to her house to protest. The girl was completely ignorant of politics, but now there came a time when her whole life became inseparable from this very politics, and she just had to accept it. Annette was as if she were alive, but it was hard to call it life. She was alone in the world, but she still hoped that her husband would be at her side. After all, they had sworn to love each other from the very end. The girl always wondered what she had done wrong, and whether she was even to blame for the family she was born into. And soon she had the answers to all these questions in a single letter that came to her only this morning. And now, as the girl stood in his office, she sighed heavily and smiled, saying that she thought he would change at least a little for the better. But that, apparently, was just naivete. In fact, he'd always been that kind of person, never thought much of her and never loved her to begin with. She, seeing the surprised look on her husband's face, asked if he thought she was wrong. Geiner was silent for a while. Then he said that he was not. The girl was already starting to get annoyed with his such indifferent behavior, so she asked for him to say something. She needed to hear his explanation on the situation. The man continued to remain silent. Then he smiled and said that he hated the Marquis Dietrich and his entire royal family, and that was a fact he did not deny. Certainly Annette knew that was what he would say, but she had hope until the very end, and she wished it were not true. The man in turn went on and said that he intended us to approach her then in the garden, and that was the end of it. He was not going to explain anything else. Annette was unable to say anything, so she looked at the letter again. She felt anger and despair at the same time. The girl, holding back tears, asked if he hated her too, along with her entire family. For a while, Geiner was silent, then said that 2 years ago a scandalous investigation came out that the royal family was secretly training spies. He was suddenly angry, and he said that it was her father who was in charge, and he was one of the spies. The man clenched his hands so tightly that they began to crunch. Geiner said that many of them later died in the line of duty, or were eliminated so as not to tell anyone the truth, and of them all, only he survived. This cost him dearly, of course. Marquis Dietrich was pleased to admit him into his entourage when he strengthened his position at court, and thus Geiner met her. When they met in the garden, he, seeing this, told her that she had heard that he was the only survivor, Colorado. She expressed her condolences to him for the loss of fellow soldiers who bravely defended their homeland. But at that moment all Geiner could do was see her dress, her jewelry, her bright smile. She had expressed her condolences as if it were a huge favor, and to him it was very wrong and arrogant of her. The girl then asked if she was also on his list of hated personalities. The man replied that of course she was. She put her head down and sighed heavily, saying that she understood now. In fact, the story was really incredibly simple. He'd just fallen in love with someone he wanted revenge on. Geiner Waldemar hates this Rosenberg, and despite all his pretenses, it really was true. The girl said that in such a case everything is very simple, so she suggested that he just divorce peacefully. She herself thought about the fact that she loved him, and did not know all this, because the feelings were too strong to see the truth. But then suddenly Geiner said it just couldn't be done. He was very serious and insisted on doing it anyway. The girl, when she heard the refusal, was very surprised and asked if he wanted anything else but revenge. She did not understand why he did not want a divorce. After all, her father and mother are dead, and the monarchy of Pavlov. In the end, the girl was left with nothing. She began to scream, for her anger was consuming her, and said that all she had was the status of his wife. She doesn't want any more of this to go on, and his revenge has succeeded perfectly. But at that moment, Geiner got up from his desk and kicked it. He walked quickly over to the girl, calling her his lady. He grabbed her face with his hands, asking where she was going to find her happiness alone. The man was incredibly angry, and looking into her frightened eyes, he was even pleased with what he was doing. But she started screaming, saying that she couldn't be happy anywhere, especially being around a man who hated her. He moved even closer and said that in that case, it was very simple. If that's the way she wants it, she'll be miserable with him for the rest of her life. Now that she saw it, his face lit by the scarlet sunset, she suddenly realized that his revenge was only beginning, and it was far from over. When they first met, they were sitting in the garden, and the girl was asking him about various things. She was also curious about how many languages he even knew. Geiner replied that he knew 4, for he had been trained since he was a little boy. When Annette heard this, she was very surprised and admired him, saying that he was incredibly clever. It is a lot to know so many languages perfectly at such a young age. She also said that she was so worried that she didn't get to study in a foreign academy. But anyway, She wasn't very good at it back in the beginning. Hayner looked at her and said that he had heard that she was an excellent pianist. The girl was a little embarrassed and said she wasn't sure if that was true, and she didn't even know if she should pursue a profession as a pianist. The man winked at her and told her that she actually played very beautifully, and he was sure she would become a very outstanding pianist in the future, so she shouldn't put her hands down. But Annette suddenly laughed and said that he could not say that, for he had never heard her really play. The man held out his hand to her and said that he could see that she could play incredibly beautifully. The girl laughed out loud and said you could see it in him too. That day was beautiful to her, and when she reminisced about it in the time that followed, I stopped pleasantly at heart. But that was before she even knew her husband hated her. When a sufficient amount of time had passed, they waded out into the middle of the lake at night, and the man, getting down on one knee, proposed to her to be his wife. Of course, the girl, when she heard about it, was incredibly happy and agreed. She was delighted that she would now be his spouse. Gaynor had smiled right in her face then, and as it turned out, had lied, saying she would always be happy with him. She immediately hugged him and couldn't think of anything else but that they had such a great love that they were willing to live it every day together. And now, when he told Annette that she would be miserable with him for the rest of her life, she could not sleep for a long time. But as soon as she fell asleep, she had nightmares that made her jump up in the middle of the night in terror. At times like this, she thought for a long time that she would have been very glad if it had been only a bad dream. But to her regret, it was the truth. Axis wrote in the headlines that the last representative of the Padani monarchy was still in power, and people didn't know how long they could tolerate her presence. The girl, when she saw all these newspapers, she immediately became very sad, and she was incredibly tired of it all. One day she decided to go outside to get some air, and when she came down the stairs she met Major Eugen, who said hello when he saw the girl. The man was a staunch associate of Hayner's. The major smiled wickedly and said he hadn't seen her in a long time, and asked if she was doing well. Annette knew he meant that she must not be doing well, but she said it was business as usual. She also apologized and went further up the stairs. Eugene, in his turn, said in a quiet voice that their chief was being courted by ladies of respect in the community. He asked, without turning to her, if she did not remember Lady Annelle, who was an incredible woman and helped his nobility in the cause of the revolution. Eugene also said that she is much loved by the people, because she worked tirelessly to defeat the monarchy. He smiled wickedly, and looked at her and asked her what she thought about it, for this girl was an incredible match for his nobility. Annette looked at him with a pitying look, and said that she did not know what to say to him. Eugene said that the news would soon be all over the printed press, and asked if she thought it right that she continued to thrive in this place like a rose in the garden. The girl realized that everyone around her wished her downfall, and not a day passed that there was not a call in the newspapers for a final solution of the monarchical question. She is constantly receiving anonymous threatening letters in her name, and no one sees her as the chief's legitimate wife, only finger-pointing and condemnation. Eugene sighed heavily and said she was a stain on his reputation, and wondered if she knew what people were saying about their marriage. She was very angry at such a reproach, and calmly said that she had recently asked his nobility for a divorce. When the man heard this, he was very surprised, and asked if she really meant it. The girl smiled and said that Gaynor had not given his consent. Apparently, he could not deny himself the pleasure of watching her suffer under a magnifying glass. She realized that she had realized this simple truth too late. So she turned to the major and told him that she would be very grateful if he would try to persuade her husband to grant her a divorce. For the first time, it seems, their interests coincided. The girl knew that she hated absolutely everyone, but she didn't understand why all this time she had just been fooling herself, reassuring herself by saying that he genuinely loved her. When night fell, Annette was already sleeping peacefully in her bedroom when suddenly the door creaked open. Gaynor entered the room and addressed his lady. He sat on the edge of the bed and said that he knew she was awake, so he asked her to listen to him. He said he had tried to back out and gloss over the matchmaking issue, but the press had beaten him to it, so there was nothing he could do about it now. If she wanted a divorce, he'd tell her to stop trying. The girl continued to pretend to be asleep, but she heard him perfectly well. Heiner, in his turn, said in a confident and stern voice that they would not let her go anywhere. At the same moment, Annette didn't understand. If he hated her so much, why didn't he just let go, divorce and go their separate ways? As if even the word divorce couldn't be uttered without scandal. She remained silent for a while, hoping that Gaynor would go away. But he stayed. Then she said that people were saying that he was the only reason she was still alive, so why did the commander-in-chief need this woman? The man made no reply. Then she sat on the bed and said that she was a stain on his reputation, and it was customary to get rid of stains. She couldn't believe that he wanted to keep her to himself and watch her slowly wither, and asked him if his resentment toward her was so strong that he was willing to endure such inconvenience even for the sake of his own ego. Gaynor sighed heavily and turned away from the girl, saying that she would have nowhere to go if she just left him. Annette asked if he thought she had hidden any estate from him. She has nothing and no one, and he knows it very well. Gaynor suddenly said that her father had connections in your society, and she probably doesn't know. But some nobles have managed to escape the country and are living quite well in exile. But the girl laughed and said she didn't want them or other countries. All she wants is a divorce. The man looked annoyed already and said that he understood that she needed a divorce, but he didn't want to hear any more about it. Annette could not understand how at what times he had come to look at her with such gloomy eyes, which were full of nothing but hatred and anger. The girl didn't understand how she hadn't noticed it before, because she only saw his gentle smile and listened to his pleasant voice. But in the end, everything she loved so much turned out to be just a pretense, a perfectly played role. She sighed heavily and thought about the fact that this man was indeed an excellent spy who was a master at his craft. She put her head down and slammed her fists into her knees and said that she just didn't want to live with him anymore. Gaynor smiled then and asked why this was sudden. Did she hate him now that she knew he had betrayed her? But to his surprise, the girl replied that not at all, for she had nothing to hate him for. He didn't even know what to say to that. She said she has no hatred for anyone, even if the whole world hates her. She can't do that because she doesn't deserve it at all, and she knows she deserves better. She said that the newspapers were constantly reporting that she was the last representative of the monarchy and needed to be eliminated as a matter of urgency, and if everyone wanted it so badly, she actually didn't even mind. Annette realized that she was still very poorly versed in politics, but she had now learned something from the people's representatives in parliament, human rights, and democracy. She learned why the people overthrew the monarchy and brought her new government into power. And even if the girl humanly doesn't understand them, she just took it as a given because everyone around her says it's her fault. Annette asked if that mattered. The man got angry and asked if she even knew what she was talking about, but the girl said she didn't care. She just wanted a divorce. The girl knew that even if she was lost, at least she would no longer belong to him as a wife. She didn't want to see him like that. She wanted to keep some of her dignity. The man was incredibly angry. He clenched his fists so hard that veins were showing and said that a divorce was a divorce. He was so angry that he grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her closer, and told her that he was fed up with her, living a good life, and didn't even realize what it would mean to her if they divorced. He looked at her with a frantic look and told her that she would be his wife forever, even if they divorced. But all Annette really wanted was to recapture the moments in which she loved him. She didn't want to hate him more because of all the things he had done. The man kept shouting and told her not to dream anymore of freedom and happiness. She must atone for her sins by being by his side and enduring the same troubles as he did. After a while, Gaynor finally calmed down. He became soon mother and said that in a couple of days there would be a banquet in honor of the opening of the new hotel, and as his wife, would have to accompany him. So the girl should be ready. She asked, surprised, if she refused to do it, would he force her to do it? Gaynor sighed heavily and said that if she continued her antics, he would send her to a mental institution where she would spend the rest of her days. When she heard that, she was very surprised and couldn't believe that he could really do that. The man slapped his hand on the table and told her not to even think about hurting him, because he would find her anyway. He had enough power to do that. Gaynor looked at her angrily and finally said that if she didn't want it that way, she should obey him. The girl, hearing all this, realized that he was originally like this. She knew that the man was not selfless, but she deceived herself and did not want to admit it. She told herself she'd lost everything, but love would come back. She had only left it for a while. Someday he would still be with her and love her in a way that would keep him guessing. In the meantime, she had only their pleasant memories, their summers and springs, their love, which she thought should be eternal. Gaynor suddenly looked at her and said that he expected an answer from his lady. The girl, seeing his stern look, was very frightened. She did not know what to do now. She didn't understand why she hadn't noticed all this before. He was always looking for gain, and it had never been love. She was just a stupid and naive girl, but in the end, she had to say now that she understood and agreed to the proposal. It was only after those words that he finally left her alone. But even if it turned out that way, she still can't sleep at night. So the girl is going to find her own medicine, with the help of which she could at least sleep for a few hours. She took a few of the pills and saw that there wasn't much left. She drank her dose and then took out a small box where she put the rest of the pills. The next morning she called her doctor named Arnold and said that the drugs didn't seem to be working for her at all. She asked if he could prescribe her any others, because she had woken up early again with a severe headache that just couldn't be tolerated. Her doctor started pulling something out of his bag, saying that she probably thought he had some magic pill for everything. But that's not true at all, because migraine is a very common condition, and it's not something you can't tolerate. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked if he really meant to say that everyone had the same pain as she did. The man was silent for a while, and then said that of course she was not alone in the world. She sighed heavily and said in a sleepy voice that she understood perfectly well. However, she had also recently developed an upset stomach and a fever, and she was not feeling well at all, and she didn't even know what it was. The doctor started looking for something in his bag again, saying that the cause could be stress or lack of physical activity. So he advised her to walk more and lie down less. To summarize, he also said that she, the lady, was just not at all used to tolerating even the slightest pain, and so they think it's something very big that needs to be treated immediately with pills, but some pain is better to just bitch about. He also said he was the doctor on the estate, but not her personal one, and at that moment he put some envelopes with the same medicines in them. At that moment the maids suddenly came in. When they heard this conversation, they laughed a lot. No one, not even the servants, respected the mistress. Annette was a little upset when she heard this, but then told the doctor that she understood perfectly and also thanked him for his help out of courtesy. Soon after that, the very event that Gaynor had talked about last night finally happened. The girl was dressed in a beautiful outfit, but she was not happy at all, for she did not want to come to the event. As soon as they entered the hall, an elderly man immediately approached them. When he saw His Highness, he immediately greeted the man and said that he had not seen him for a long time and was very glad that he looked so beautiful. Gaynor immediately smiled and, extending his hand to greet him, told the gentleman it was good to see him too and congratulated him on the opening of the hotel. Mr. Schmidt said that it was really all thanks to his financial support and asked how things were going in France. He believes that his hotel chain will thrive there. The girl moved a little farther away from them so as not to interfere with their conversation. Gaynor replied to the gentleman that if the proletariat supported them, it would be much easier for them to cope with the faction, so they would work. After that, several other people approached them, including the general. They stepped aside and began to have various conversations on different topics. Annette stood aside and thought about what she thought of this man as unpredictable. She did not understand why he was so insistent that she go to this event where no one was expecting her. The man in turn talked about how it was her duty as his wife, but now she realizes why. When they turn around and see everyone looking down at her and whispering among themselves, she realized that he only wanted to show her off. She rarely left the estate, and people might even begin to wonder if he really had a wife. Still, not every circumstance would provide her with as much venomous and intense attention as this event. So she tried to keep her head down and didn't speak to anyone. Then Mr. Schmidt turned to Gaynor and asked if he had already received a marriage proposal from the lady. He, in turn, smiled and said that unfortunately he had to refuse the proposal. When the man heard this, he was very surprised and asked how it was possible to do so, since almost everyone says that they are for each other straightforwardly the perfect couple. But Gaynor smiled and said that naturally he refused, because he was puzzled as to why he had offered it to him at all. Because after all, he is already a married man. And at this point the guy began to stare at Annette, who in turn stepped back to drink some alcohol. The girl in turn thought about the fact that even if everyone thought she was a nobody, she didn't understand how it was even possible to matchmake her own husband with other women in her presence. Annette took the second glass of rather strong alcohol, and finishing it in a gulp, thought about how incredibly sorry she was that things were happening like this. But suddenly someone came up to her and put his hand on her shoulder. The girl immediately looked at this person and saw her husband there. He suddenly started to take the glass away from her with an angry look. Annette didn't understand why he was doing it at all and why he was so angry, but she didn't interrupt him in any way, because she knew it was better for her to keep silent. But at that moment, they all suddenly heard someone's voice saying with a happy sigh that he really hoped everyone was enjoying this deep fall night, addressing the ladies and gentlemen present at the event. The host stood on a stage that was in the middle of the room and told everyone present that a very special guest had been invited especially for them by the owner. This man is a brilliant folk artist from Denmark, a pianist named Felix Kafka. When the girl heard this, she was incredibly surprised and could not believe that it was really him. This man, an outstanding pianist, also holds all the famous international awards. The figure is very popular and is admired for his talent. Annette would never have imagined that she would hear him play in a place like this. But at that moment the man came on stage and began to play the first notes of his outstanding melodies on the piano. The girl recognized from the first seconds what this tune was, and began to enjoy with all her soul his performance, because Felix was indeed brilliant. She hadn't really played the piano in 3 years, but she would never forget that simple melody she so loved to play on heavy and boring evenings. She looked at Felix Kafka, who was completely immersed in the music, and with every note she felt the hot breath of life filling her whole body. She was ready to listen to it for hours and gain energy. This man was like a messenger from heaven, speaking of ideals in this filthy world. He had been her idol for a long time, when she was a naive girl just beginning to learn about the world. From the very first day she touched the keys, she dreamed of hearing him play live, to understand how he did it, and to see the man completely immersed in the process. When Felix's fingers played the keys, the girl felt all the emotions he felt while playing. He was so professional that he could convey such vivid emotions through the notes that it was impossible to hold back tears. And shortly afterward the music ended. The man stood up and bowed to his audience, who began to applaud furiously, for they too enjoyed his performance. In fact, when Annette was very young, she wanted to become a pianist, just like him. Thanks to her father's connections, she was able to see Felix in person several times. The girl got his autograph, he cheered her on and even had a little private conversation, inspiring her to play. But now it was completely different. She knew Felix was of low birth, and he must have secretly despised her when he was invited to meet her. She knew he could never express it openly, because it would be considered bad form. But now that her reputation was at an all-time low, he might not even say hello. Because of this, the girl became very upset, and even lowered her gaze when she saw him talking quietly with the other aristocrats. Gaynor, seeing this, was about to comfort her, but suddenly they were interrupted by a woman's voice. It was some noble lady who inquired whether Lady Waldemar did not play the piano. When the girl heard about it, she froze. She didn't expect anyone to know about it at all. But the lady came closer, and smiling wickedly inquired if Lady Annetta would mind playing something for them. They would love to hear her play. The girl was so frightened that she remained silent for a while. Then she turned to the people who had also gathered around her, and said that she was not at all ready for this. But this noble lady turned out to know a lot about her, and said that she had at one time won 3rd place in an international competition, and had once even given private lessons to people. The stranger nudged the girl in the back, telling her to stop being modest, for it was just as she said, she hadn't played in a long time, and without practice everything was forgotten. The lady said that she had heard her being taught how to play since she was a little girl. She of course just wanted to embarrass her. Annette didn't know what to do, and tried with all her might to get out of her arms, looking at her husband, who only stared back at her blankly. He was not going to help in any way. The stranger led her to the stage, telling the girl not to be afraid, and tried to encourage her, saying that she was sure to do well. Annette did not understand how she could have hoped that he would begin to defend her. She glimpsed Felix Kafka also watching intently. She figured that since they wanted entertainment and to enjoy the spectacle of being particularly blue-blooded, she would make a fool of herself. But the girl wasn't going to give them that pleasure. She was going to disappoint them. However, shortly after he started playing, she felt very sick and recalled a memory from her childhood. That day her father yelled at her and told her to run away. He didn't have time to explain. The man had a gun in his hands. Her father told her to get up and run as fast as she could to the back door, never turning around. The girl didn't even have time to get up from her seat before a loud gunshot suddenly sounded, and she saw a huge pool of blood on the spot where her father had just stood. Annette, in a trembling voice, moved closer to him and asked if he was all right. She could not believe that this was really happening. Her father, of course, did not answer her, for he was already bleeding profusely. Then some unfamiliar voices came from the door. One of the men asked him why he had done it, for he could not shoot without warning. He had not expected to do it himself, and said it was an accident. The man pointed his gun at the girl in front of him and asked if this was really the Marquis's daughter. Annette was terrified. She could not utter a single word, but just stood there crying. Then one of the men said that she was probably just amusing herself by playing the piano. She suddenly remembered how all those people had laughed evilly at her. But she couldn't take it anymore. She didn't even play the first note on the piano, so she blew up and started to run away, because her emotions had taken over her completely. All the guests present were very surprised, including Gaynor. They did not understand what was happening and why she suddenly started to run away. The girl in her turn ran to the room for the lady and sat there panting. Soon she heard someone's footsteps, and raising her head, she saw Gaynor in front of her, holding her purse, which she had left behind. The man looked at her in surprise, not understanding why she was panicking. She said she wanted to go home and didn't explain. In fact, these feelings were like manifestations of post-traumatic stress disorder. But Gaynor, when he began to analyze it all, didn't understand what kind of trauma she might have. In the evening, as he studied the papers, he did not know why she had cried, for this woman had not shed a single tear in 3 years. Annette lived in a magnificent estate, went to balls, and knew no grief. So the man did not understand at all what kind of injury she could have that she could not even play in public, but ran away all in tears and panic. Gaynor was furious and thought it was all nonsense. Then he suggested that she might have been upset by the tune Felix was playing, but she was talking about divorcing him with a stone face. Even though they had lived together for quite a long time and had grown attached to each other, the man knew he didn't need her. He let Annette go, but he couldn't let this woman go after all he'd had to endure to get her. He absolutely didn't care what he had to go through. He realized that divorce would be the illogical choice. He scattered all the papers on his desk with his anger and emotion, and with a heavy sigh, he finally began to calm down. At that moment, Gaynor had a flashback of sneaking a glimpse of Annette, who had joyfully played the piano as a very young child, and it really annoyed him that this silly, irresponsible love from his lonely childhood was not going away. He'd love to put it behind him. But he couldn't help himself. Annette, when she got home, took a little breather. After that, she went out into the main hall at night, where some huge thing stood under a blanket. The girl walked closer to it, and as she removed the cloths from it, she realized that it was exactly the piano she had played since she was a little girl. It had been brought to the estate from her ancestral home. The girl opened the lid to look at the keys and just sat there for a while. She knew it very well, the sound that the piano made when she pressed one of the keys. But now it did not bother her at all. It was useless to her. She sat there and with a cold stare only looked at the instrument, thinking about the fact that she couldn't even press the keys, let alone play a full melody. The day her father was killed, everything ceased to matter to her. She only feared for her own life. The girl didn't care about power, connections, and money. People said that it was only because of this that she achieved mastery of the piano. She thought she would eventually recover from this terrible psychological blow, but now that she was afraid to even touch the piano, she realized that the trauma stayed with her. With a cold stare, she stared at the keys and realized that now she was finally left with nothing. The next morning, a butler came to the Gaynor's house who was very concerned. But the girl not only avoided her husband, but also stopped eating, as he had been informed. He wouldn't call it a full-blown rebellion, but her behavior really annoyed the man. He likes things to be by the book, and when things go wrong, he always fixes them. So early in the morning, the Gaynor went to the girl's room. He knocked, then went in. But Annette was sitting at her embroidery without even looking at him. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really did nothing but embroider all day long and didn't even eat anything. He looked her straight in the eye and asked if that was her protest. She didn't even look up and said that he didn't have to worry about that. It wasn't the reason she wasn't eating. Gaynor looked toward her dressing table and wondered why she needed so much medicine. He was incredibly angry and immediately opened the nightstand where the very medication was kept. Annette noticed it immediately and asked what he was doing. He took a small iron jar and, holding it out to the girl, asked what it was. He looked very angry and asked her to answer immediately, and this immediately turned her back on him, and with her head down, said that it was just a pill, nothing wrong with it. But Gaynor then said that surely they must have been prescribed by Dr. Arnold, and asked if that was correct. And she still didn't want to look at him and said she just didn't accept them. That's why there were so many of them. At the man, when he heard that, he looked at her and realized she was lying and didn't even blush. Gaynor sighed heavily and said that he had ordered her to bring her some food, so she should wait and he would take all those pills for now. Annette, hearing this, was very surprised and wondered why he had to do it. Then she calmed down a little and said that she would not eat either, because she was not hungry. The man turned around and started to walk away, wondering if she really wanted to starve herself just to starve. But the girl calmly replied that she had no appetite at all. Gaynor, in turn, went to the table and took some papers, saying that if she was going to the other side of the world, she should choose a more dignified way, for she was of the Rosenberg family after all. Annette, when she heard this, she didn't reply anything. She was too hurt because the injury was still fresh, especially considering what she had just recently remembered. The man, when he heard that she answered nothing, looked at her expression, which was devoid of any emotion. But at that moment, a maid knocked at their door, and turning to the gentleman, said that the food was ready. Gaynor immediately told her to set it down and come out. The maid immediately brought trays of freshly made soup and a few slices of black bread into the room. He turned to Annette and told her to eat, but the girl, without looking at him, continued her embroidery and asked him to come out, for she was able to eat on her own. But Gaynor suddenly asked if she really wanted to just take all that food and throw it out the window. The girl then became very angry and started to scream, asking what if she really wanted to do that, what he would do in return. The man looked at her in surprise, not understanding why she was all worked up, and suggested that it might have something to do with the pills. Then he exhaled and in a calm voice told the girl that it wasn't like her at all. He also called her his lady. Annette was no longer paying attention to this kind of address, and putting the embroidery aside, asked what he could possibly know about her. But then she sighed languidly and said that she had forgotten that he had to know something about her in order to gain her trust. Well, now she said it's completely different. She's no longer his lover and there's no Rosenberg family. The girl had tears rolling down her eyes, and she said that she was now a complete nobody, and it was all because of him. Gaynor answered nothing to this, but only stared at her, for she was really now a nobody. She is a proud and very naive princess who remained only a formality, and everyone who loved her with all his soul is just dead. But he didn't understand why she was so beautiful, so noble, just like when he first saw her. Such incidents reminded him of his cursed, unhappy childhood, so the man told her in a cold voice to eat until he forced her to do so. Gaynor couldn't understand it in any way, why all this was so hard on Annette. There was nothing else to do but sit down at the table and start actually eating. At least at first she pretended to present the spoon to her mouth. Then Gaynor looked around the room carefully and looked at her embroidery. He realized that she was just awful, and the girl was doing it completely wrong. In fact, a few years ago, when they were still dating, a girl had given him a small handkerchief that was embroidered with an incredibly beautiful pattern. That shawl was embroidered with hideous grace and skill, but now she embroiders like an inept young child, and when he compares that work and what he sees now, it surprises him. After a while of silence, Annette turned to Hainer and said she would like to go somewhere by herself, but it was a long way from home. But the man, when he heard about it, he said that of course that was out of the question, and he also added that he knew perfectly well where she was going. Annette was silent for a while, running her spoon over a plateful of soup, and said with a heavy sigh that she hadn't even hoped he would allow it. She smiled without looking up, and said that there had once been such a thing, that it was she who had asked to be allowed more freedom. But now it was the opposite. Gaynor didn't say anything to that. He just watched her steer her spoon around the plate for a while and said that she probably wouldn't finish it when he left, but this time she could do whatever she wanted. With those words, he turned around and started to walk away. Before leaving, he turned to the girl and told her that if he ever heard of her refusing her food again, he would send her to a mental institution because he thought she had an eating disorder. After that, he quickly slammed the door shut and left the girl alone. Annette was so upset that she only sighed heavily. She felt so bad that she couldn't do anything. Gaynor, when he returned to his office, immediately called Dr. Arnold. He quickly picked up the phone and said that he was listening attentively. The man introduced himself and asked the doctor if he could talk to him about one thing. Arnold said that of course he could do that, and also asked His Highness how he was doing. The man got straight to the point and said that he had found a medicine at his wife's house. He needed to know the name of it. It was a white pill with a round shape, and there was also some number written on it. Arnold immediately recognized the drug and said it was just a sleeping pill he had prescribed for his wife, and wondered if there was something wrong with it. Hainer said there was nothing wrong and immediately said goodbye and hung up. For a while he just stood there staring at that medicine in silence, and then he thought it wasn't even funny. The man quickly tossed the can into the trash, not realizing if she was really going to swallow them in order to die. Gaynor didn't know that a weak woman like her could have the courage to do that at all. He began to take off his coat, thinking that she must see it as her only way out of this situation. But he didn't know how a girl like her could know what real grief and despair were, even the words of other people. And the sound of the piano could make her shiver like an aspen leaf. Beatings, torture, starvation, and torment. This woman had never experienced such a thing and probably had never even seen it with her own eyes. The man remembers them sitting in a clearing on another date, and Annette said he had incredibly beautiful eyes. The man then pretended to be very surprised and said that it was the first time he had actually been told such a thing. Annette replied that she didn't believe it was his first time. After all, they are incredibly beautiful, and she likes them very much. Gaynor frowned and asked what about the rest of him. Did he really not like him? But the girl immediately began to protest and said that she had her own preferences and would never have a real relationship with a man who only thought of himself. The man immediately laughed and said that he liked her personally, regardless of her looks. Hainer put his hand on her cheek and, moving closer, said that even in spite of it all, she was the most beautiful thing in the whole world to him. These memories began to consume him headlong, and he even wished the girl would fall into real despair. He wishes for her to be truly miserable as well. He really wants her life to be as bleak as his was at this moment. The man took off his shirt, and the inscription on his chest that said he was a dog of the Padunian regime was visible. And in those moments when the girl would be on the verge of a breakdown, Gaynor would gather the events close by and just watch all the action. The next morning, Annette got ready early and went outside and sat on a bench watching the birds nearby, enjoying themselves. She, on the other hand, was only thinking about how tired she was. She looked up at the morning sun, which was shining brightly enough to lift her spirits. But the girl began to remember the times when she still had hope of changing her husband's attitude towards her. She thought that if she got pregnant, he would treat her better. There was absolutely no tenderness, or at least no passion, in the moments he entered her. But he never rejected her, and she'd never seen him naked, all the time they'd been doing these things with their clothes on. After a night like that, he didn't even want to have breakfast with her. He would just silently leave her in his empty bedroom and go spend the night somewhere else. She wondered at times like this when he would stop being angry with her and be like he was before, loving and caring. But now she did not understand why he needed it at all, and why he just did not reject her. The girl suddenly felt the sun starting to warm up, and decided to return home gradually. Annette supposed that perhaps he liked that she harbored an unfulfilled hope toward him. But in truth, the girl, after all she had been through, wished she could just disappear somewhere, that no one would bother her, and that she would never see this false life with him again. She closed her eyes for a while to enjoy the last rays of the sun, when suddenly she heard someone speaking to her. She turned immediately to the side to see who the voice was addressed to. When she opened her eyes, she saw a familiar woman standing in front of her. It was the woman who was the one who was making a match with Hainer. The red-haired girl approached her and asked if she had a moment, and if it was possible to talk to her. She had no choice but to say yes. Then she glanced back, and there stood Eugene, who had just escorted her. She gave him a glance that told him to go away. The man sighed heavily, and turning around, began to walk away. She noticed this and realized that she must have known Eugene Cheese, and they were probably fellow Revolutionary Party members. The girl, in turn, sat down next to Annetta and said that she could finally meet her in person. She, in turn, showed no interest and told her to get to the point. The stranger was a little surprised at this abrupt behavior, and inquired how she was doing at the manor, and said she had heard that the girl had been quite out of it lately. Annette didn't even look at her interlocutor and said that there was really nothing wrong with that. She's just a homebody. Where did you go to school? She smiled and said, that I could tell from her. I'd only ever seen her picture in the papers before, and she was so eager to realize what she's really like. But he turned to Lady Anneli and said that she didn't care at all how she was doing here or what kind of person she was. So she asked her to speak plainly. Anneli was silent for a while. Then she said that rumors had reached her that his noble lord would not grant her a divorce. She also said that she really doesn't like the girl, and she almost hates her, and when she thinks about what her late daddy did and how she lived so luxuriously, her cheekbones droop with indignation. She said in an indifferent voice that she respected their chief's opinion, but didn't think Annetta was worthy of it at all. Anneli also said that he should marry her, if only to keep the reactionaries from raising their heads. For some time the girls were silent, and then Annetta smiled a little and said that she thought it would be better to discuss the matter with her husband, for she was powerless in such a matter. But the girl said, Madame, that she was warning her for the first and last time. She had an opportunity, through Parliament and the press, to press his nobility to divorce her. Annetta told the girl that she knew full well that she had demonized her to the public, in pursuit of her personal interests. At first she had felt defamed, but still she blamed her for her father's affairs, which she had not even suspected before. Anneli, when she heard this, was very indignant. She looked at the girl in surprise and asked who she thought she was, but Annetta went on as if nothing had happened, and said that the girl was right after all, even if it was a little exaggerated in places. She could not be completely innocent in such a situation. She sighed heavily and said that it had been a whole 3 years, and she no longer resented her and respected her power struggle. The girl said that this was really her sincere feeling and thoughts. Anneli, when she heard this, was silent for a while, not answering anything to it. Then she stood up and said that, as she had said, the decision to divorce was not in her power, so she could certainly not worry about it. Annetta looked off into the distance and said that this marriage would certainly end soon, and that all we had to do was wait a little longer. Shortly afterward, the girl returned home and started looking at some papers. They were mostly donations and bills. But then suddenly a maid knocked at her room and said that a gentleman had come to see her and was asking to see her, saying he was an old friend of hers. Annetta was very surprised to hear this. She immediately put the papers aside and asked, "Who is this old friend?" The maid said that he passed on that the girl might know him by the name of Augsgar. When the girl heard this, she immediately recognized the man. And soon afterwards she went downstairs to Augsgar Schutterer, who was just about to meet her. This man is the second son of Count Schutterer, an old friend of the Marquis Dietrich. And the girl, when she went out to see him, immediately inquired what fates he had come by. In fact, he and Annetta have been friends since they were children, and he even proposed to her once. When she turned him down, he went abroad to study. The guy suddenly walked over and hugged the girl tightly. But in fact, they hadn't even talked since then. After a long embrace, the man pulled back and, examining her from head to toe, said that she had lost a lot of weight since their last meeting. In fact, the girl had heard that his family had fallen under repression, but he himself had not suffered because he was abroad. However, falling in with aristocrats nowadays isn't much of a favorite. The man said that even despite all this, she still looked beautiful. They walked to the hall, and Augsgar also said that he had written to her, but for some reason she hadn't replied, and he had no choice but to come and visit her. Annette immediately asked if he had sent the letters to the Rosenberg residence, but the man did not understand why he had to do so, and said that if she was the wife of the commander-in-chief, he sent the letters at once to the chancellery. When she heard that, she felt a little uneasy, but she replied that she should probably look them up. Well, of course she had a pretty good idea what might have happened to all those letters. They sat down across from each other, and the girl inquired how he was doing in general, and how long he had been back in Padania. Augsgar said he just came to gather his thoughts. He works in a faction, he said, and he would like her to see the country. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked if he was talking about the faction. The man said that, as she probably already knew, many of their circle had fled to the faction from repression, and having graduated from the university, he had stayed there to live permanently. Annetta, when she heard that he had become ambassador, said it was a great success, but the man laughed and replied that he didn't care about that success. If he could live his life the way he wanted, not the way he had to, things would be completely different. He also said that he had gotten married, but had already divorced last year. Annetta, hearing this, was very surprised. She couldn't believe that he could really do all this in such a small amount of time. Well, the man smiled and, pouring himself some more tea, said that it was really just a sham marriage for the sake of citizenship, nothing more. They were silent for a while, and then Augsgar said that he had something very important to say to her. She knew better than he did what it was like to live in Podania, because she was being slaughtered in the press, and her husband wasn't even going to defend her. And he looked the girl straight in the eye and asked her if she was ever going to get a divorce to start a new, happier life. The girl immediately looked at the maid, who had been standing nearby all this time. After thinking, she decided to tell him the truth and replied that she wanted a divorce, but that everything was too complicated and confusing. Augsgar looked at her pityingly and asked if this was all because she just wouldn't have anywhere to go. The girl sighed heavily, but did not answer the question, and wondered if he had come to remind her of what she already knew perfectly well. The man realized he had said a little too much, and replied that that was not why he had come at all. He wanted to meet her to offer to go with him to the faction. Annetta, when she heard this, was very surprised. She couldn't believe that he was really offering it to her. Well, the man was absolutely serious and said that his feelings for her had not cooled, and if she married him, she would immediately get citizenship in that country. So he was offering to let her take his hand and go to the New World. He smiled, and also added that he would make her definitely happy as she deserved it. However, Annette at this moment had a flashback of Geiner saying the same words, but she ended up getting the exact opposite. Now the girl was already more cautious, and did not understand why this man suddenly appeared so unexpectedly and wants to take her in marriage. She sighed heavily and said that her husband certainly wouldn't let her go, and Augsgar got a little upset. He wondered what was the point of staying in this place if she was in captivity, if she couldn't even make her own decision. After calming down a bit, he said, summarizing that she was in dire straits right now, and he was her only salvation in such a situation. She wasn't ready to make a decision right now, so she asked if she had time to think about it, because it was a very unexpected offer. The man even blushed from embarrassment, and said that she herself did not know what it was with him all of a sudden. He apologized, and said that in fact he had been dreaming about this moment for a long time, and understood that it was a surprise for her. Then he found something in his pocket, and said he would give her his card, and began to describe something on a small claptrap of paper. Augsgar said he was staying at a hotel, and wrote the address on a piece of paper. He also added that she could go straight to his room, and not go to the information desk. Annetta didn't understand what was the matter with him at all, for this was completely unlike the man's behavior. But now, As he held out her paper to her, she noticed that he was looking at her the same way he had looked at her as a child. The girl smiled and accepted his piece of paper, and began to remember their childhood, when she knew nothing at all about how the world worked. The man said goodbye to her and told her to be sure to keep in touch and reach out if she needed any help. Annetta escorted him out and waved goodbye, telling him that if she needed anything, she would of course turn to him, and thanked the man for everything. Soon the door slammed shut, and she looked at the piece of paper he had given her, still not understanding why he had suddenly decided to come after all this time. Count Schaefer was the submission ambassador to the faction of nobility in exile, and a man proposes marriage to her. She thought of the fact that her father was the emperor's nephew, and she is thus a person of royal blood. But then suddenly she thought of restoring the monarchy. In fact, the monarchists in Padania were almost all wiped out. All because, under the careful guidance of the revolutionary leader Geiner Valdemar, he was able to do so. He successfully suppressed all pockets of resistance and became the sole ruler of Padania. The exiled nobles have no way to get revenge without the help of foreign countries, and if the girl escapes with Ausgar now, it will help the other nobles. So she needs to make her choice as soon as possible. The girl looked at the paper again and realized that this would be her last chance to get away safely from Geiner. When evening came, Annette came to dinner with Heiner, who straightway forced her to do so. They ate in complete silence, and the man only occasionally glanced at the girl who still hadn't eaten anything from her plate. He was silent for a while, and then said he had heard about Ausgar's shooter coming in and wondered what they had even talked about. Annetta, without looking up at him, wondered if the rumors had not told him about it. But the man replied that he wanted to hear all the details from her lips. She sighed heavily and said that he had asked her to divorce him and go to faction with him, and that was that. Heiner looked at her in surprise when he heard this, and asked her if that was why she had been demanding a divorce from him for so long. The girl said that it was not at all. It was the first time they had met in 4 years. But he wondered how he could know that for sure. Perhaps she was secretly corresponding with him despite his best efforts. Annetta, when she heard these words, was very much surprised, and asked if he had really taken and concealed Ausgar's letters from her. The man was getting angry, so he clenched his glass even tighter. And then he said he wouldn't answer that question. This guy had given her a helping hand, but he wasn't going to let her take it. Finishing his remarks, he said that the girl would certainly never be able to get out of this place, no matter how hard she tried or who tried to help her. There was a long silence after that. The girl thought about the fact that, of course, if Ausgar was from the monarchist movement, Heiner would never give her to them, and he would not file for divorce. Also because, being his wife, she would be useless to them. The girl knew perfectly well that he would not let her go under any circumstances. In fact, she was very happy to see her longtime friend, and some time ago she would have even agreed without hesitation to the proposal. But if he only wants her because she's royalty, she's certainly not going to agree to that. She wouldn't make the same mistake as before, and she wouldn't let herself be taken advantage of. And yet the girl still didn't understand why Geiner and his associates had such different opinions. Both Eugen and his girlfriend want him to get a divorce, and Annetta wants it so badly. But not him. This man is the only one who has that opinion, and she doesn't understand what's behind it. The next morning, Annette got ready early and on her way out told the butler that she was going to church. She did not need an escort, so she asked to be left alone. The man in turn bowed and said that she needed permission from the commander-in-chief to go out, otherwise he definitely wouldn't let her go. The girl tried to insist and said that she didn't want to disturb anyone. The butler replied that he couldn't let her out any other way. Annetta at this point couldn't stand it and started shouting, asking if she even needed to seek some kind of permission to pray. The man realized that she was in a very bad mood, so he didn't argue with her anymore and opened her exit after all. The girl, without much trouble or effort, eventually found herself outside the estate and called for a coachman. When he stopped, she immediately got into the wagon and the man inquired where she wanted to go. Annetta thought for a moment, and then said that she wanted to go to Lanchester Station. The man immediately replied that he would drive her as soon as possible, and they set off. Soon after that, the girl found herself at a station where there were many people. She bought herself a ticket, and after a few minutes, She was already sitting in her train car. Annetta looked around, still unable to believe that she could see ordinary people so close. But when she saw the men looking intently at the newspaper, she hoped very much that they weren't reading about her at all. Then the girl looked at the old woman who was sitting opposite her, and saw that she was holding a cross in her hands. And with her eyes closed, she was saying something to herself. And she suddenly wondered what they were praying for. This is an old woman. Then she thought about the fact that she hadn't been to church in a long time. People talk about God answering prayers. But no matter how much she prayed, she never got an answer. So the girl is very tired of waiting for salvation and asking God for forgiveness. She just wants to see the sea, which she often dreams about in deep dreams. Annetta sighed heavily and looked out the window again. The old woman who had finished praying asked her what was wrong, since she was sighing so heavily. She was very surprised that the old woman had spoken to her at all, and said that nothing had happened at all. Then she asked where the girl was going. Annetta relaxed a little and said that she just wanted to see the sea and have some fun. The old woman then asked if she was going alone, without her fiancé. The girl, lowering her gaze, said she was already married, but her relationship with her husband had not worked out, and they were thinking of getting a divorce. So she's going alone. The old woman in turn asked if they had children. Annetta replied in a quieter voice that they had no children,